With the second raid tier of Dawntrail releasing, and the first raid tier so rotating out, this seems like a great time to have a bit of a retrospective discussion about this first raid tier. How was it? How did it go? This retrospective will of course be my experience of the Savage raid tier, but let's get to it. To start, my quote-unquote Savage raiding history starts before Final Fantasy XIV. Don't worry, I will keep it short. I raided mostly in random groups in World of Warcraft's Wrath of the Lich King. I also raided Dragon Soul in its Cataclysm, but it wasn't until Mr. Pandaria that I beat a tier on content. Notably, beating Garrosh Hellscream Heroic 10-man before Mythic was a thing. And then, for WoW Legion, I raided on and off for every tier, participating in the hardest content the game had to offer. Mythic Plus was more my jam though. For Final Fantasy XIV then, I ended up our raid leader for a raid team for the second raid tier of Shadowbringers, Eden's Verse, which fell apart reasonably early in the Iconoclasm Savage prog. I then briefly dabbled in Party Finder Savage in the second raid tier of Endwalker, but didn't get past Protocarpy before losing interest. However, the streams of me doing this is right here on YouTube in VODs if you're interested. After such a hiatus, Arcadion Light Heavyweight was my next venture into Savage raiding, which is where we start today. Initially, we gathered together whoever was interested in coming along for Black Cat Savage, but over the first few weeks we put together a fixed raid team, a static, for more reliable runs, spending less time reviewing strategies and hopefully reprogging faster. Reasonably early, this resulted in a team consisting of, obviously me, Aradil, Zip, Cat, Malo, Shaq, Naomi and Ham, with most of the roles being decided by what players wanted, but some decided by what was left. The schedule was up to 6 hours once per week, occasionally doing re-clears off-stream, which then leads to how the tier went, starting with M1S, Black Cat. I think this is a great boss to start a raid tier with, especially one starting off a new expansion. The boss has several mechanics that require team coordination and also actually paying proper attention, and due to an apparently unintended slight undertuning of the tier, one of the harder mechanics, Raining Cats, is entirely skippable even for average raid teams. I'll be upfront about the fact that our raid team used guides the whole way, so this was not blind prog. That said, what turns out to have become a tradition that started right here, for our very first pull of Black Cat, we discussed various future mechanics and coordinated pairs and light parties. We were ready, but we forgot to discuss one particular mechanic, the quadruple crossing, and promptly wiped. The big walls for our team throughout this fight was the double clone phase with leaping 1-2 paw and leaping quadruple crossing, the second Mouser phase featuring splintering nails and overshadow, and raining cats, with the second Mouser phase among the three being a smaller wall among the three. For the leaping clones, what really caused problems was dealing with the mechanics while simultaneously keeping track of which way they're going, as in the moment it can be mildly confusing to keep track of the fact the clone will jump left, but also it's facing south, so left is right. The solution was two macros that pointed west or east. For the second Mouser phase, the challenge was in coordinating the player that was getting punched fast enough that everyone else could get into position specifically for splintered nails, which is roll targeting cones. Once the team got faster and more consistent with their punch positions, the nails sort of resolved themselves, mostly. And finally, let's just say that in the time where we procced Raining Cats, we learned of this quote-unquote cheese strat of having the tanks take most of them. In fact, this trick got so ingrained in our team that when we much later actually blind procced Extreme 3, we brought out this exact same trick for ice bridges all on our own. Now, I imagine some of you may be confused as to how we possibly could have had needed to proc Raining Cats given how skippable it is. Our raid team consists of some players with significant Savage raiding experience, some players with experience with hard content ready to party, and also some players that really have had to grow into Savage raiders, which is to say, many of our clears have had not the most impressive performances in terms of raw DPS overall. This has required us to care a bit more about getting the mechanics right, as we hardly can rely on skipping anything. Might as well assume we don't. What makes Black Cat such a good starting fight is that she demonstrates a mechanic that requires party coordination right out the gate. She has mechanics that require pairs, light parties, roll stacks, and even mechanics that can more easily be resolved by communicating with a macro mid-fight. She efficiently introduces a lot of things that are just generally helpful to learn for a raid team. Finally, while the fact raining cats, and obviously what follows after it, being completely skippable has been seen as a weakness of the fight, as many groups never had to deal with such a unique mechanic, I sort of see it as a strength of the fight. In a way, it motivates newer players to Savage raiding to really bring it, because if they do, they won't have to deal with the really hard mechanic. In a way, Black Cat just stands out as an incredibly great starter fight for new Savage Raiders, in my opinion. Next up, we have M2S, Honeybee Lovely, and of course, as tradition dictates, we completely face-planted for the drop or splash mechanics due to a misunderstanding of our planned positions. The outstanding mechanics that caused trouble for us especially, and even sometimes still did on reclears, was Alarm Pheromones 1 and 2. Rotten Heart also gave us some issues. Alarm Pheromones 1 is a mechanic that seems to have caused a lot of trouble for a lot of players, since by design it has a bunch of randomness to it, so you can't just fully spreadsheet it. The general solution most party finder groups have used for this, I believe, is Mario Kart. However, our team refused to do this and tried various strategies before settling on the way we do it. We tried full YOLO. We tried what we dubbed Crash Team Racing, which is essentially Mario Kart but much closer to the center. We tried a mix of the two. Ultimately, we settled on the Alarm Pheromones 1 uptime strategy from Big Kobe, and once it worked, it was very funny to use each week, almost like pulling a rabbit out of a hat. For Alarm Pheromones 2, the main problem was in figuring out where to bait the first AoEs to, and recognizing fast enough whether the line spun clockwise or counterclockwise. Once we got that down, the phase went pretty well. And for Rotten Heart, what really caused trouble here was of course that our Honeybee Live phases typically weren't perfect, combined with not being sure how many defensive cooldowns we needed for the finale. As a static with a very vocal leader, that's me, Rotten Heart was also dealt with primarily by me calling the order of players, instead of the individuals checking their own buff necessarily. A part of this was also simply me learning to do the calls in time. This also leads to a general tip on raid leading from me. Figure out what things the team needs or benefits from getting callouts for. What mechanics are they failing on? Where can you help? Sometimes it could be something really silly, like warning that a raid wide is coming after some mechanic because certain party members forget to prepare for that. An example in our team is the center-outer stage combos, where I always called out whether it was a donut or a circle first, as a few team members had issues with that. If it helps the team, it doesn't really cost you anything to call it. Overall, Honeybee Lovely adds a nice amount of structured randomness to a raid tier that has mostly entirely predictable mechanics, with both First Beat and Alarm Pheromones 1 requiring some thinking on the fly to resolve. A fight where the punishment for failing certain mechanics is a harder fight and a stricter DPS check is certainly also pretty unique, and I feel like more hard content could use stuff like this. Even casual fights could use this, in fact, to motivate getting the mechanics right to shorten the fight. The way the fight kind of alternates between two different sets of rules as it swaps in and out of Honeybee Live is also super cool. Thanks to the healing from the hard buffs, it also seems much more likely you will get all the way down to the wire in this fight, getting the first clear just as she's about to hard enrage. After that, we have M3S, Brute Bomber, and of course, as tradition dictates, we do get swiped by the lariat and dives right at the start early on. The main mechanics that really caused trouble for us here were Barbarous Barrage, Final Fuse Down, and Fuse Field. In some capacity, Chain Deathmatch caused some minor issues, but usually it and all the other mechanics overwhelmed us as an after effect of the three problem mechanics. For Barbaros Barrage, the problem was mainly that while we all could aim the knockbacks well enough, all it takes is 1 or 2 misses and it's back to the start again. So we had a significant amount of wipes to just that. Needing to aim a circular knockback at a rather specific angle can be hard while performing a rotation after all. For Final Fuse Down, what I call Squeenix RNG got us quite a lot. We might have the DPS get the short fuse first 5 times in a row, and then they get the long fuse, and everyone gets confused. Some might not even remember what their position is if the mechanic reverses. And for Fuse Field, it was another mechanic where I took the lead of calling every detonation in order to make sure we got it right. The big challenges here were actually entering the phase with everyone alive, and also having enough defensive cooldowns to survive it. A general tip here is that while you might feel inclined to wait until everyone is fully ready, stretch out the time you have to resolve the mechanic as much as possible. Defensive cooldowns will run out, so being quick is likely safer in the long run if you can. As soon as everyone has enough HP to survive a detonation, send it immediately. This fight also has another example of a mechanic that is really good to call out if you can. Quadruple and octuple lariat, as well as quadruboom and octoboom dive, as it can sometimes be difficult in the moment to unpack that whole thing, on top of the fact it can be either circle or donut, or proximity or knockback depending on a visual cue. Once again, raid leading tip: try and call out the things your team may actually benefit from getting called out for them. What makes Brute Bomber very interesting to me is that to many, Fuse Field is the final hard mechanic of the fight, or at least it is where the challenge peaks, meaning that if you survive that, the rest of the fight is more about holding on and keeping up the pressure. This also simultaneously makes the fight seem weirdly short and weirdly long at the same time. That doesn't mean the fight is over after that point, but the remaining mechanics are mostly rehashes of previous mechanics with a little extra on top. This fight also features another oddity, perhaps in the way our team deals with boss mechanics. Sometimes we were asked why we didn't just invuln the tank busters if invuln was available. Naturally, we did invuln the final 2 tank busters, as it reaches a point where it gets a bit ridiculous to tank normally. However, the earlier instances of the tank buster is weak enough that tanking it normally is very reasonable. For that reason, and the fact that the off-tank doesn't really have anything better to use their defensives on, we deal with those tank busters normally so we could keep invulns in case we needed them. We have even on Reclius had situations where we had to do the later ones properly because invulns were used for other reasons. Speaking of which, both the way Knuckle Sandwich and Brutal Impact deal their damage really feels like they give some room to deal with the mechanics in the best way for you. In fact, of all 4 bosses in the raid tier, I'd argue Brute Bomber is the one that is the most viable 2 solo tank with minimal nonsense, which on the one hand can be viewed as the fight not being challenging enough, but on the other hand also can really emphasize the flexibility of the fight design, which is what I will choose to focus on. It really makes it interesting. Which finally leads us to M4S, Wicked Thunder. In our team, each subsequent boss took longer to overcome than the last, and especially Wicked Thunder pushed some of us so hard that they second guessed if they even had the chops to actually beat the fight. Yet, we pushed on. What probably comes as very little surprise to most, the mechanics we had the most trouble with were Witch Hunt, EE2, the intermission itself, Midnight Sabbath, and Sunrise Sabbath. But I'd argue that Witch Hunt by far was the hardest to overcome for our team. Starting the fight, we spent pretty much a whole raid session just trying to overcome Witch Hunt properly, which also leads me to say that putting a mechanic like Witch Hunt at the start of the fight was an incredibly wise choice in design, as I feel it would be far too mean later in the fight. Partly due to simply learning to deal with Sunrise Sabbath without markers, but also partly due to how challenging we found Witch Hunt, we kept the clock markers for the entirety of the raid tier. In a similar fashion to the final fuse down problem from Brute Bomber, Witch Hunt leaves 4 different configurations. Tanks in a donut, tanks in a circle, healers in a donut, healers in a circle, and they each are handled slightly differently. Incidentally, EE2 has a similar issue for every individual. Short 2, short 3, long 2, long 3, and then on top of that, whether the mechanic in between is pairs or spreads, and left or right, meaning you really have to pay close attention to everything. For the intermission itself, it really boiled down to dealing with the alternating cone AoEs, which is really a minor thing, but undershooting or overshooting the distance can make it harder than it seems. On top of that, a general, smaller issue we've had peek in many times throughout the various bosses is the fact that AoE healing has a maximum radius, which could mean the DPS most distant from the healers sometimes would just die from a severe case of no heals. This we eventually resolved with a raid callout to come in for heals after each set of cones. In an interesting twist, we procced a large part of this fight using tank LB3 for cross-tail switch, but one particular pull we recovered after the intermission with a healer LB3 instead, and promptly discovered we were capable of dealing with the mechanic without tank LB3, which we then, after agreeing with Shaq and Sip, the healers, decided to flip into using DPS LB3 for future proccing. What made Midnight Sabbath hard is simply that if anyone dies to the first hit, then essentially, for each dead player, there's a possibility another player dies to the second hit, and often we would get just the first hit wrong. This is also another case of Squeenix RNG, where sometimes we would get only wings multiple times in a row, and then if there was a single cannon later, we would get it wrong just due to confusion. Certain combinations also just generally seemed a lot less frequent, leading to some of us having a particularly hard time with them. Mainly if they involved a lot of cannons. And finally, Sunrise Sabbath. The main problem was aiming the cannons, but overall, most of the team figured it out. Admittedly, I was the one player in the team that just never quite got it right, so it was a lot more likely whoever was aiming alongside me would die. For the curious, our best performance was skipping about half of Sunrise Sabbath. And no, we never did try Uptime Strat, also known as AutoCAT, I believe. The Wicked Thunder fight is amazingly well designed in my opinion. The flexibility of being able to choose to not use Tank LB3 for the Phase 2 start simultaneously means that you have the option to choose to use Tank LB3 if you need it for some reason. The fact the fight leads with some of the hardest mechanics in the entire fight is great. I'd argue that all three of the Sabbaths in Phase 2 are easier to do than Witch Hunt, but because they are so much deeper into the fight, most players get only a fraction of the practice with those mechanics, which can make them feel comparatively much harder. This is both the upside of a single fight with no checkpoints. Mistakes earlier in the fight matter later in the fight. You need to keep the ship together the whole way, while also being a bit of a downside. Even though Phase 2 is the big exciting reveal, a more balanced experience requires that the further in the fight you get, the more the fight has to focus either on reiterating on mechanics seen before, so as to not elevate the difficulty too much, or while introducing new things, keeping them a bit easier than earlier mechanics to balance out the fact that it takes like 7 minutes just to get a chance to try again if you get it wrong. I remember when I was proccing Eden's vs. Führer, Savage, back in Shadowbringers. I felt the Blaze Tornadoes was so mean because it was so hard and so strict and had basically nothing to do with any prior mechanics, and it was so far into the fight, relatively speaking, which meant that while it was a challenging mechanic, it magnified massively in difficulty simply because it was so hard to get a chance to practice it. Wicked Thunder deals with this much better by putting the meanest mechanics in the first half. At least, in my opinion. Just to clarify, obviously, not all fights have to be designed in this way, and simply put, placing harder mechanics later is a clear way to make a harder fight, based on what I just said. So it's a design choice. My overall opinion of this raid tier is that it is an excellent introduction to Savage content. New players to hard content in Final Fantasy XIV got a very nice start in Dawntrail with fights like Valiamander and Everkeep, flowing into Black Cat just to get you started. The fact the fights have relatively tame DPS checks for more experienced players allows newcomers to this type of content a chance to focus a bit more on just learning the mechanics. And because each boss is tuned the way they are, the player still can feel motivated to do better, to skip mechanics, perhaps mechanics they don't like to do. A big weakness of the raid tier, however, was more in the social aspect, I would say. It was quite quickly stamped as a quote-unquote very easy raid tier, which meant players that were new to the content were more likely to feel terrible about it if they found it challenging. Relative to other content in Final Fantasy XIV, this raid tier is still hard as Savage is. So if you got your start in Savage here and found it challenging, don't let that discourage you and keep trying. Another concern is that since the development team itself has stated that the tier was a bit undertuned, players that recognize their personal damage performance as being perhaps not the most impressive, of course get extra concerned about being good enough when the next raid tier comes. Not much we can do about that. However, as I stated at the start, our static here, the stream team as it were, is not entirely comprised of a squad of turbo gamers, but rather nice players that want to work together, that try as hard as they can. And that is good enough. At least, that seems to be the case. We will see if we can beat the next Savage tier too, but we certainly enjoyed this tier. So much so that we still had it in us to do a full 6-hour session of just M4S once the weekly lockout was lifted, just for the fun of it. So, how was your experience of the light heavyweight raid tier of Arcadion? Did you do it in Party Finder, in a static, a mix? What happened and how did it go? Did you have fun? I would love to hear about it all in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, in the Savage version of the Black Cat fight, she summons a grand total of 8 clones, with a sort of unstated implication that with the 9 lives of a cat, the 9th life is her own. However, in other languages, cats don't always have 9 lives. For instance, in German, apparently, cats only have 7 lives, which would make no sense if they had pointed out this mechanical Easter egg directly.